In this video, I'll be sharing how I knitted this Raglan sweater inspired by the infamous Lirika Matoshi Cloud Sweater, but adapted in style and size to fit a toddler. I'll do my best to share everything that I can recall from the entire process, especially as a beginner knitter. I think this would be good to look back on in the future. Timestamps and chapters are listed if you'd like to skip around. Quick origins before we get into all things technical. I bought these 3 skeins of yarn on sale years ago and didn't know what to do with them until the cloud sweater appeared on my feed, and the matching color scheme made it ideal. Given the limited materials, I'd yield something relatively small, and there's an adorable wee human I wanted to gift this to.
Disclaimer, the recreation of Lirika Matoshi's pattern is purely for education and appreciation. Full ownership and credit goes to the designer and her team. This was made as a personal gift, not for sale or profit.
Also, I kind of backed myself into a corner as I was attempting to pattern and knit this simultaneously whilst working on his sister's birthday faux fur coat and bag, alongside another project I had going on. Lastly, let me share some insights into where my knitting skills were as I started the sweater. Now, I had the basics of knitting committed to muscle memory. I knew how to cast on, knit, purl, that leads to garter and stockinette or the stocking stitch, and of course how to bind or cast off. I have read patterns, increased, decreased, and worked in the round before, but these definitely need a refresher. Here's what I had to learn and familiarize myself with for this pattern: sizing, gauge, learning how to read and knit a complex pattern that I'd be plotting, working with 2 yarns in tandem, whether it would be stranded Colourwork, Fair Isle, or intarsia, weaving and twisting in yarn tails, 1x1 rib stitch, and how needle sizing affects it, buttonhole stitch, how to sew a button to knit it work, duplicate stitch, dry or wet blocking, weaving in end, and mattress stitching, everything together. To an advancing beginner, there's certainly a lot to take in, thus I approached each new technique one at a time as the sweater progressed. I would dip my toes gently by searching and watching videos from more experienced knitters with clear, in-depth instructions, visuals, and advice. I've linked all the videos I referenced in the description. I'll try to link them in the iCard as well where I can, especially since a lot of footage I captured was on my first try, and for some I might not have captured followed up footage with improvements, so I don't want to pass off my mistakes as fact. Moving on to how I planned and plotted the pattern, I followed So Woolly's Raglan sweater pattern as my foundation to plot my own. First, I watched through the 2 videos she has on this and read up on the written instructions on her website. So I knew I'd have to adjust the number of stitches to fit the toddler since her sweater is geared to a younger age group. I had the chance to somewhat take his measurements months prior, but I also made notes based on some of his spare clothes that we hang on to when the cousins stay over. I deduced the number of stitches by inputting the yarn gauge and my desired measurements using the calculator on Stitch Fiddle. After that came loosely plotting the pattern on Excel, affixing the 1x1 square grid, numbering my rows and stitches, identifying the stitches per section, and coloring in every individual square for clean and clear visuals. This can be done freehanded on Stitch Fiddle, but I prefer to do it on Excel so that I can modify it on the fly, mark where I am, and have it be mobile. This would see a few developments and changes later as I fine-tuned and balanced the pattern to correspond with the size and the limited yarn. With that briefly sorted, I got started following her progression, beginning with the back piece. All my pieces started off using the long tail cast on, trying to leave a relatively short tail since I wouldn't yet know how much yarn would be left. I kept it relatively tight on the needle, allowing the stitches to slide with just enough ease, and I'd start off knitting with the tip of my needle as to not stretch the cast on too wide. And while this 50-gram, 150-meter skein calls for 3.75mm needles, unfortunately, the smallest needles I had at the time were 4mm, so I made do. This was mistake number 1, not using the correct needle size for the yarn. Second, especially on a 1x1 rib stitches, as I later learned, requires going down a needle size in order to get the tight braids and stretch. Otherwise, it would be too loose and won't look so great. And since I would continue onto stockinette with the same size needles, it was very obvious that something was amiss. But specifications aside, the bigger trouble was understanding and reading the 1x1 rib, especially at the beginning. The braided effect doesn't start to show until the 4th or 5th row, and it was a bit confusing and messy trying to switch between the alternating knit and purl stitches on every row. For the first 3 pieces, I had to restart from the cast on since I would make mistakes and be unable to fix them without twisting the stitches on themselves. After yay amount of times, I started to see the pattern. By the end of the row, once the work was turned to the wrong side, say I started and ended with a knit 1, on the wrong side I see the horizontal purl bump indicating that this row will start and end with a purl 1, and if it had a slant then it would be a knit stitch. To start and end with the same stitch, the total number of stitches on the needle would have to be an odd number. Another thing was was seeing where my working yarn was naturally falling. Say it's naturally falling in front, I knew I'd have to go against that and bring it back for a knit stitch. Subsequently, when it's falling behind the needle, it's time to bring it forward to purl. For all my pieces, the 1x1 rib ended on the right side of the work with the starting yarn tail hanging on the left. The stockinette stitches began with a purl roll on the wrong side. Being familiar with stockinette, this passed by quite quickly before I had to start on the stranded colorwork / Fair Isle. Now, what is stranded colorwork versus Fair Isle knitting? Essentially, it's working with 2 or more colors of yarn simultaneously in the same row to create a pattern. I'm using these 2 terms interchangeably since what I'm doing can be classified or fall under both terms. When it comes to working with 2 colors simultaneously, there's going to be a dominant foreground color and a non-dominant background color. The way the yarn is held when knitting will determine the color's dominance. From what I understand, the yarn placed below is the dominant color or foreground. Then there's the slack or ease between floats. Floats are yarns carried over several stitches before changing colors, and slack refers to the tension or give of the floats. The goal is to have enough slack that the floats will lay flat and even on the wrong side of the work when finished, not too loose otherwise it will easily snag, but not so tight that the work bunches and curls. I tried out different slack tensions as I worked. I think anyone would start off too tight than too loose before finding that sweet spot, but keep in mind that pressing with some steam from the iron, dry blocking on the curled piece would make it lay flat, and what might look like too little slack would actually be just right, and there's certainly a nice balance when the carried stitches are close to equal as opposed to those that are too spaced out. For white gaps between color changes, yarn floats are either twisted or weaved into the back of the work. For example, if I'm knitting 10 stitches in green before 1 stitch in blue, I'll twist in the blue yarn every 5 stitches. It'd be too much to twist it in every 2 stitches, but I wouldn't go past 5. It'll be harder to gauge the right amount of slack if it's being carried over so far. As an English knitter, I left my yarn tails hanging, then picked and threw my yarn as I worked between colors, always keeping in mind which yarn is my dominant color. Initially, I was quite confused, but after consistent practice, it became second nature to strap the yarn. Grabbing both yarn tails, I throw it over my needle as if to knit or purl, but then I'd untwist and release the yarn I was trapping from the needle, making sure it's worked in before continuing to knit. When it came to reading the pattern, knit rows are read from right to left and purl rows from left to right. Typically, repeating patterns are shown in the single scale as I've done at the top of my spreadsheet, but I'd gone the extra mile to have it visually fully laid out. Having it done this way would allow me to match the patterns, especially on the side seams where the grass would connect, and have it be seamless. It would also allow me to map out where and how I'd want the clouds to look on each piece. Initially, I thought I'd knit the pieces and then duplicate stitch the clouds on top since I didn't thoroughly have my patterns done and didn't know if the clouds would fit. I've also noted the number of stitches per grass blade and numbered the gaps between them. Another helpful thing is noting the repeating rows so that I can just knit according to the colored stitches on my needle. Moving on to the Raglan decreases, here's where chaos and carnage ensued. So Willie's pattern called for single and double decreases only on the knit rows, and it needs to end with a certain number of stitches. What I had to do was determine what that aforementioned number of stitches would be for me to meet my measurements and how many rows and stitches would have to be dropped in order to reach said stitches before casting off. Using basic math and visualizing it on my spreadsheet, I determined the equally divided number of single and double decreased rows to get that Raglan shape, and that will be the decreases for all my pieces. If all the pieces have an equal number of rows for the decrease, it'll be easy to align them when mattress stitching. For my single decreases, the left leaning decreases are done with a slip knit or SSK. This is where you pick your stitches off the needle as if to knit in order to twist the yarn legs around, but then slip your needle back onto the stitches and knit it together. Since 2 stitches are picked up, 1 stitch will remain from knitting them together. As for the right leaning decreases, it's done with a knit 2 together. It's exactly how it sounds. You knit 2 stitches together on the needle and you've dropped 1 stitch. For the double decreases, it's done with a slip 1, knit 2 together, and pass the slip stitch over for the left leaning decreases, and a knit 3 together for the right leaning decreases to drop off 2 stitches. All the main integral bits are figured out. By that point, I'd finished the back and was already working on the second sleeve when I realized I was quickly running out of my blue yarn. I did place an order for another skein of yarn from the brand with the best shade match I could find, but I really wanted to try to use as much from my set of yarns since the replacements aren't the exact same. Seeing as the back piece was disproportionately larger than the sleeves, I decided to unravel it, salvage and reuse the yarn, replot it to size, and knit it again. I wound my yarns on some empty thread spools. I had to snip off all the duplicate stitches I'd done, not worrying about saving it since I still had a good amount of white yarn to use for the rest of my sweater. By this point, I was already quite familiar with the progress of the patterns, so it wouldn't take too long to knit it up again. When it came to the sleeves, the pattern here is relatively simpler since it only had single increases on every knit row using the yarn over method to create a smooth incline from the wrist to the widest part of the underarm, the bicep, before repeating the Raglan decrease. decreases. Based on the number of stockinette rows before the start of the raglan, I increased on every 4th and 5th row. That's a knit row, as there's an odd number of rows in total. I did accidentally miss one of the rows of my increase and had to substitute it on another row. I also began to incorporate the Lirika Matoshi Cloud pattern in the center of the sleeve using stranded Colourwork this time. I genuinely didn't realize that there was a cloud in the center of her sleeves until after I'd done mine. Now let me show you the difference between a pressed finished piece versus one right off the needle. Here are both my sleeves done. One has been pressed with steam, a dry blocking method to relax the yarn and have it laid flat, and the other is wrinkled on itself right off the needle. With the sleeves and redone back completed and pressed, I could move on to tackle the front panels with a bit more confidence. But first, I'd like to mention that I mistakenly miscounted the back and it's much smaller than it should be and would need to be compensated by making the front slightly wider. This would offset the side seams a little once it was sewn together. Alongside everything I've previously shown with the 1x1 rib hem, stockinette, stranded Colourwork / Fair Isle, and the raglan decreases, the front panels incorporate a garter stitch button to collar band, buttonholes, and the v-neck decreases. I started with the easier of the two, the panel where the buttons would sit, which in Sew Willie's pattern is the right front. Now I want to call myself out for being too preoccupied and confused differentiating the left and right that I missed out on the discrepancy here. So I followed Sew Willie's pattern, having the buttons be on the right front, which when you're looking at it is the left piece. Now in a grown adult, this is fine, regardless of gender. Typically men's shirt buttons are on the right while women's are on the left. Historically, this was done because men would dress themselves while women would be assisted when being dressed, and since the majority of the world is right-handed, the buttons would be facing the right side of the dresser when buttoning their lady. Frankly, in this modern day, I think we should retire that notion since the average person dresses themselves without assistance, and unless you're left-handed, buttons would be more instinctive to be on the right. However, in the case of a toddler, the child wouldn't necessarily learn to button themselves until the schooling age. In this instance, it's a do as I say, not as I do. Place the buttons on the left front, which is the right-facing panel on screen. This also serves as an indirect apology to the parents of the child for making it awkward and non-intuitive to button the sweater. Moving on, these cute floral buttons are from my late grandmother's personal stash. It was the perfect embellishment to all the natural elements already in the sweater. I'll get into sewing the buttons later. Getting back on track, I received my new yarn in the mail, and my presumptions about not being too dependent on them were right. They're clearly quite different from color, fiber properties, to the way it's been twisted. Now the green wasn't going to be usable at all, and at the time of finally editing and uploading this video, I made a one skein bralette and posted it to my fashion Instagram, whereas the blue was still manageable. It was a bit brighter than my current blue yarn, but it actually would turn out fairly well. Going back to plotting the pattern, I made sure to make the band border wide enough for the button, and unlike knitting the border after the piece is done by picking up stitches horizontally, I'd be working with it simultaneously, which meant I have to incorporate where I'd be switching colors for the band when it comes to stranded Colourwork / Fair Isle. I wouldn't be able to maintain both separate colors for the body and band without anchoring the yarn tails together. I think this would require understanding the intarsia method, but I thought that would be a tad too much for me given all the techniques already needed for the sweater. So instead I started out with all green, then shifted when blue starts naturally taking over towards the center, and then it would slowly be blue till the end. Now here's where I encountered a bit of a problem. I didn't realize that the yarn change had to occur on the right side of the work so that you don't see the blip change. Instead, you just get the smooth blocking from green to blue. In doing so, I didn't think to twist or weave in my yarn tails on this first piece as I brought it to the knit row, so there's a long float that I'll have to reinforce when I stitch the button on. I just have to make sure to place the button there. But that wasn't my only issue. I initially wanted to use up what's left of my old yarn before using the new skein until it dawned on me that I could have saved it to use for mattress stitching so that I'd solely be using the new yarn for both front panels to have a clean finish. Admitting defeat, I unraveled and knitted it once more. At this time, I still didn't realize the button discrepancy. Onto the v-neck decreases, I followed Sew Willie's pattern and made a single decrease on every 4th row, a knit row. It would be a slip slit knit SSK decrease for the right front leaning left and a knit 2 together for the left front leaning right. But on the last few rows, I did a double decrease to finish off the raglan and v-neck together, and I'd be left to knit the garter collar. I knitted the garter collar long enough to fit each sleeve's cast off and the half of the back, since I need to attach the colors together at the center back. Throughout all of this, I was noticing how loose my garter stitches were, but like I've said, I'm using a much bigger needle size than the yarn's recommendation, so that's the reason for the imbalance between all the different stitches. I repeated the same thing to my left front after ensuring the pattern was correct on the right. Now I had to divide and mark which rows would get the buttonholes. Now I did film knitting the 1 row buttonhole stitch after working out the first one, but for reasons I can't recall, mistakes were made. But honestly, there are better videos explaining this, which I've linked below. There's a lot of twisting back and forth, and frankly several methods that can be very confusing, plus this video is so long already. Let me just bypass this step a little, and now I have all my pieces done and pressed flat. All that's left was to sew on the buttons, weave in all the yarn tails that I had left hanging before learning to weave them in when knitting, and mattress stitch everything together. That's the last chunk of the project. Beginning with the buttons, I grabbed my tapestry needle and threaded my yarn. Since I was using shank buttons, the eye was wide enough to fit the body of the needle and yarn, I placed pins to serve as button markers and sewed on the button in the center of the button band, going over and across my stitches and doing a double pass in the button shank before double knotting off the button on the wrong side of the work. I did this for the rest of my buttons, gearing myself up for all the weaving I'd have to do next. For my added benefit and knowledge, I looked up the proper and different weaving methods for all my stitches, the 1x1 ribbing, reverse stockinette, and garter. 1x1 ribbing is weaved in by following the direction of the braid legs to channel the yarn in between the braids before carrying it over to the next leg of the V and going through in the opposite way. This is done by wrapping the braids individually instead of straight channeling so that the needle doesn't snag or go in between the ply as opposed to the tunnel. For garter and stockinette, it's done in a similar fashion by following the natural teardrop loops by sewing according to the smile and frowns of the horizontal garter rows. Finally, we can get to mattress stitching or seaming all my pieces together. I began with the raglans. Here I was referencing a raglan specific mattress stitch video before going back and rewatching Sew Willie's raglan mattress stitch, since I wanted to start sewing from the top of the raglan and work my way down to the bind off, since that bit was a bit more confusing and I wanted to work towards it. But the two videos were incompatible. There's a different effect when half stitches are picked over full stitches when mattress stitching on the raglan depending on your pattern. And so Willie's pattern, she'd left 2 stitches before starting the decreases, so when I followed the other video, I picked up half stitches on the end, which created a center braid, which isn't wrong, but wasn't the look I was going for. For the other seams, picking up these half stitches would be fine, but specifically for the raglans, this wouldn't work for me. Once I figured it out on the other raglan, getting the right look, I undid and redid this for all the raglans. When it came to the bind off portion, I can't explain exactly what to do, but when done right, the stockinette braids look seamless. I picked up every single bar to truly reinforce and strengthen the seam, but it's recommended to pick up 2 just to speed up the process, especially if you're working on a big project. The strength would be the same, but since I picked up 1 at a time, I kept that consistent throughout. Wherever I could, I used the long cast-off yarn tails to sew the pieces together. As for my other seams, I learned that the border edges of my stockinette in some areas were quite loose due to the first time stranded Colourwork / Fair Isle knitting. I should have let the ends clean and started the repeating pattern a stitch or 2 from the edge so that when I sewed it up, it would match instead of being cut off like this. On top of that, it would be better to knit neater and clearer edge stitches, but this is something I didn't know to think about until after the project was done. I do have a reference video link that I hope to implement in the future. After sewing up all 4 raglans, I moved on to attaching the collar. Now, I can't exactly say that my method or technique for attaching the collar is correct, so take my words with a handful of salt. I picked up the garter bumps and picked up the bar in between the braid of the cast-off to attach them together because of the incorrect row count. I had to pick other spots of the garter as well to make up for it. There was a little spot that had some loose gaps where I went back in to fix. Finally, for the side seams and the sleeves, I had to bring myself out of the tailor and seamstress mindset and work on stitching the piece flat for as long as I could. What that means is I typically sew up the sleeves first and then attach them to the body. However, working the 3D sleeve into the flat body would prove difficult for knitted garments. Then there was also the foreign method to me of stitching from the bottom of the side seam and worked towards the wrist. With that, I was finally done. I was adamant about getting it done on that day and I was quite proud, not only for the finished product but also because it was completed not only on schedule but earlier than I anticipated, which is always a great surplus. I had it nicely wrapped and sent it to my cousins that weekend. If you made it till the end, oh my god, wow, thank you so much. I appreciate that a lot. Now that's all. Till next time.